everyone. I'm Maggie Mahan, the Assistant Director for Community Engagement with the State Historical Society of Missouri. Thank you so much for joining us for today's program, Missouri Mysteries, Chapter 2. Just in time for Halloween, oral historian Sean Rost is here to explore mysterious lights reported in the skies around the Missouri Lead Belt. In this second edition of Missouri Mysteries, we'll learn about the lights, their appearance above towns throughout the region, and why Piedmont and nearby Clearwater Lake were dubbed UFO Headquarters in 1973. If you missed the first chapter of Missouri Mysteries, you can catch it on demand on our website at shsmo.org. Today's program, along with all events in our virtual programming series, is made possible thanks to the generous support of the State Historical Society of Missouri's members and donors. So thank you again for joining us. And now I will turn things over to Sean. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you very much, Maggie. And thank you everyone for joining us today. This is chapter 2, as Maggie said, of Missouri Mysteries. And it's become a series I've been very fascinated in and very interested in since last year's presentation about this time. In that edition, we looked at the Hornet spook lights, we looked at the Blue Man of the Ozarks, and finally Momo, the Missouri Monster. And in turning attention towards this year's presentation, I was intrigued by not only the report issued by the federal government over the summer on UFOs and kind of unveiling information and videos that people had never seen before, but also looking forward in 2022 for what will be the 75th anniversary of the Roswell, New Mexico incident. So today's focus is going to be on the town of Piedmont and the area of Missouri known as the Lead Belt. Now, the Lead Belt, as you can see in this image here, is going to be a section south of St. Louis and just to the west of Interstate 55, incorporating towns like Farmington, DeSoto, Ironton, and Fredericktown. And on the very tail end of that on the bottom southwest side is going to be the community of Piedmont. Now, this area gets its name, the Lead Belt, from the lead mining and other sorts of mining that existed in the region dating back prior to Missouri statehood, well back into the 1700s. And to focus on this, there's a lot of stories in and around Missouri that could be told. The story of Piedmont in 1973 was particularly interesting, not only for the larger history of the Lead Belt and some interesting collections related to that, but also for, as we'll talk about, project identification later on. So as there are many other UFO stories and mystery stories, I encourage you to look into them and find the history behind them and do some research on them. Today's focus is going to be largely on Piedmont and the Lead Belt and how Piedmont became, as the image shows there, the UFO headquarters of the country in 1973. Now, for most people, when we think of the term UFO and of technology and things like that, most attention is drawn back to Roswell in 1947. And as the story goes, in that summer of 1947, some mysterious objects were seen in the sky, and there was a bit of essentially crash materials had crashed into the Roswell, New Mexico desert area and were discovered by a rancher in that area. After that time, there were a number of similar sightings. Some have labeled them as copycat sightings throughout the United States. And these images here really get to the heart of that here in Missouri. Not only of flying discs being recorded in the area coming from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, but also numerous sightings in and around areas like Princeton, Missouri and Neosho, places along Harrisonville and even central Missouri and eastern Missouri and southeast Missouri. And interestingly enough, we can see here on the right there, an interested photographer looking for authentic photographs of these flying saucers, willing to pay a decent amount of money there in 1947 for what they deemed to be authentic images of these craft. Now, going forward in time after Roswell, the United States enters a phase of really interest in not only UFOs, but interest in space. We can think of, as we get into the late 50s and early 1960s, Sputnik with the Soviet Union. We can think of the space race with Mercury and Gemini, and later on with the Apollo missions. And there's a kind of a shift in some ways towards space and technology and interest in that. Additionally, in popular culture, as we'll see after Roswell, there's a growing interest in tech and in popular culture and in movies, novels, all kinds of things towards the idea of UFOs, spacecraft, people coming from distant planets. Certainly not new in any ways, but certainly increasing in a surprising way here after 1947. So a couple of the images here are of advertisements for drive-in movies and for things to be seen at the theater, Killers from Space there from 1954, and playing at the Crest Drive-In the day that the Earth stood still in 1952. Additionally, we see flying saucers are incorporated in a number of cultural elements in American society as well. Here on the left, we can see the use of flying saucers to advertise for a local grocery store in Clinton, Missouri, in Henry County. And in fact, this was not the only one I encountered in doing research. There were several communities where, local grocery stores, local companies would hire pilots in the area to fly up in their airplanes, dropping these paper discs and saucers down to the ground that were basically coupons advertising a local sale or a discount on a sale at a different store. Additionally, we see it incorporated a little bit into religion as well. The middle image there comes from a evangelical worship service in the Springfield area in 1953, in which the Fern Huffstutler, the evangelist, is having a sermon. Basically, I saw a flying saucer, describing not only a biblical message and certainly one of salvation and healing, but also in many ways talking about, as it says, modern science's most talked about subject matter. So we could see that. And again, that was not a singular advertisement as well. There was many of them in the 1950s where there were evangelists and church leaders who were using the theme of flying saucers and space within their sermons and their messages as well. And by the mid to late 1950s, we begin to see an addressing of the issue by the federal government, particularly with the United States Air Force. A number of investigations were taking place to look at issues like Roswell, other sightings that had occurred in the 1950s, and an explanation was offered at that time for what these discs, these flying saucers, these lights in the sky allegedly were. And by 1952, the Air Force was allegedly getting up to 1,500 UFO sightings a year at that time. So a number of theories put forth by these investigators, both connected with the government as well as with private investigators, ranged from everything from high altitude aircraft reflecting sunlight, atmospheric reflections of light sources on the ground, meteorites, fireworks, flares, distant planets, searchlights, satellites, hoaxes, and of course, the more commonly referenced one, as we can see on the right there, which was weather balloons used for various studies that were seen in the sky and later crashed down to Earth as well. Now, turning our attention to Missouri specifically in some ways, we can see here an image of a man by the name of Buck Nelson. And Buck Nelson has an interesting collection here at the State Historical Society of Missouri, based out of our Rolla office. He lived on a ranch in Texas County, which is down in kind of south central Missouri, near the town of Mountain View. And in 1954, Buck Nelson claimed that he had been basically picked up by a UFO and by extraterrestrials, and that he had been taken on an interplanetary voyage throughout the universe. And he published his book in 1956 entitled My Trip to Mars, the Moon, and Venus, retelling this tale of where he had been with these extraterrestrials. Around the same time, he began to host what was a long-running spacecraft convention in Texas County that ran through really the 1950s and into the 1960s. And these conventions attracted hundreds of people, in many cases, not only people who were interested in the idea of UFOs and this unknown technology, but also people from the press, people who were visiting, going through that area of Missouri on vacation, various curiosity seekers in many ways. And these images here come from the newspaper from the Kansas City Times in 61 and 64, detailing a couple of the newspaper accounts of his conventions, his spacecraft conventions overall. And the number you see there next to his name, R0759, is a collection of materials related to a booklet that he put out about his spacecraft convention about what could be expected there, and basically a way to recruit people to come visit the convention, to talk at the convention, and ultimately to be engaged with the materials that he was interested in and promoting at the same time. And I want to thank Katie Seal from our Raleigh office for providing these newspaper clippings for Buck Nelson and information about him. Now, at the same time, as the spacecraft conventions are kind of winding down in Texas County, there is a particular sighting that draws some interest. And again, this is not the only sighting in the portion of the Lead Belt area, but in Farmington and Flat River, there was a sighting in 1966 that drew considerable attention to the area and really coincided with an interesting event in that community. So in 1966, 3 teenagers basically tracked what they thought was a UFO and photographed it over the town of Farmington. And on the left there, you can see the initial photograph taken by one of the young men there of this craft. And interest in the community really increased there as that happened in March of 1966. And by April, the local junior high science club in Flat River was actually making balloons and sending them up into the air with messages for whoever they deemed to be flying this UFO. They were in many ways replicating, in some cases, the UFO as well. And these traveled up, and they didn't get many messages back from outer space, but they did get messages back from neighboring communities, even as far as the state of Illinois, from people who had gotten these balloons after they had deflated and come back down to earth in various fields and homes and communities. But this interesting UFO experience also coincided with the induction of Flat River into Look Magazine's All-American City campaign in 1966. So as Look Magazine comes to give the award to Flat River, it kind of coincides with this UFO sighting a couple weeks earlier. So as the town has a parade of 90 floats, including, various state dignitaries, local organizations, local businesses, the governor was in attendance virtually in some ways, actually, interestingly enough. He called in from his home in Charleston, Warren Hearns. But there were also a number of floats that touched on this recent UFO phenomenon in the community. On the left there, you can see a float of a UFO object. In the middle there is a interesting banner that says, "The universe salutes you, Flat River. We wouldn't miss it for the world." And finally, on the right there is a series of images from a person dressed up as an extraterrestrial being who is not only noting the fact that Flat River is known now as an all-American city by Look Magazine, but that it gets a universe distinction of being an all-universe city as well. So interestingly, in that connection as well. And we'll come back to Farmington and Flat River here shortly. Now, the focus for today is going to be on Piedmont in 1973 and getting a little bit into 1974. Now, to begin the focus on Piedmont, we need to understand the story of what happened in that community in the late winter, early spring of 1973. So here's the basic story as it was relayed through the media and through various witnesses. And then we'll kind of break down that story in its various elements to understand who was involved and the various theories put forth about the incidents. So in February 1973, the 21st of February to be exact, the Clearwater R1 JV basketball team was traveling back from a tournament and a game near Dexter, Missouri. As they traveled along Highway 60, members of the team and the coaching staff saw some sort of light in the distance off of Highway 60. They initially took it to be simply an aircraft, perhaps a helicopter hovering just off the highway or slowly flying over the area, and dismissed it. They turned off of Highway 60, moved up closer to Piedmont, and turned on to what was Highway 49 near an area of the state called Brushy Creek. And again, they spotted a similar light in the sky. And this time their curiosity was piqued by the incident. So they pulled over their vehicle, got out, and proceeded to observe this object with this light source in the distance. They said it was hovering about 50 to 100 feet off the ground. and just off in that distant space. After about 5 minutes, the light source lifted up, they said, and disappeared over a nearby ridge. Now, the players and the coaches didn't really present this information to the press. And in fact, the coach at the time, Reggie Bone, didn't really tell a whole lot of people about it, thinking that, what are people going to think of me if I'm telling this story about seeing strange lights in the sky? But nevertheless, information gets out rather quickly about this strange incident in and around the Brushy Creek area. This clipping here from the Wayne County Journal Banner from early March kind of details what has now become a local phenomenon, people going out into the community to see these lights up in the sky and trying to figure out what it was. Despite a number of people making sightings, local officers from the Highway Patrol cited nothing in their observations of the area. And yet by April 1st of 1973, a little over a month after the initial sighting by the team, Police Chief Gene Bearden told the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that he estimated that roughly half of all Piedmont residents had made some sort of sighting information aware to him. So basically they had made a call to him to tell him that they had seen something up in the sky within a month. And here's a couple of the images that are going to come forth here. This is from the Wayne County Journal Banner from March 22nd, 1973. Of an image there, you can see zoomed in with the arrow above the drive-in movie theater in Piedmont. And then more lights in the sky here from late March and then early April, a potential landing site after some investigators found some burnt brush and some knocked over trees in and around the area of Brushy Creek. Now let's get to the main people involved. And I should say there are many stories, and we'll touch on a few of them here. But I'm going to break down a little bit about the three major people connected with this story in terms of their sightings, the ones that get the most press attention, and then look at three investigators who came to Piedmont to look into the story of the lights and their interpretations. Now, I mentioned the story about the JV team and the coach. The coach was named Reggie Bone. He was a member of the faculty at Clearwater R1 School District. He taught boys PE, driver's ed, health, and coached both baseball and basketball at the school. And he had taught at Clearwater since mid-1960s, about 1965, 66. And you can see there his description of the incident. It was too dark to make out any size or shape. Its lights were red, green, amber, and white, as he describes the incident in and around Brushy Creek. The second individual was Maude Jeffries, again, another faculty member at Clearwater R1 School District. She taught vocational photography. She was originally born in St. Louis and had moved to the Piedmont area in 1933. As a vocational photography teacher and an avid photographer, many of the photos that emerge early on of the lights in the sky come from her. In fact, the image here of the image over the drive-in theater is actually one of her photographs from her home that kind of gains national attention. You can see her there being interviewed as she shows off her camera and materials. Now, she kind of advised her students to go out into Piedmont and to take pictures of what they were seeing in the skies at night as part of kind of, photography class, really, in a lot of ways, which proves to be quite interesting. And she traveled around that part of Piedmont up to Clearwater Lake, over to Brushy Creek, to really get these photographs of the various lights in the sky. And she had seen it multiple times by the time the photograph had become quite notable in the local and statewide press. Now, when asked what she thought of them, she expressed some certainty that it was involved with and connected with the federal government, and that if the federal government wasn't the cause of the lights, they certainly knew about them, saying, quote, "If the government doesn't know about it, why don't we have all these nosy government people down here investigating?" Suggesting that, if there's no one down here to look into it, they must not care too much about it because they already know what it is. Lastly, another major figure that emerges is Gene Coleman. And Gene Coleman is another teacher at Clearwater R1. And something that struck me particularly in the research was all three of the major sources early on for these various lights and interactions are all teachers at Clearwater R1. She taught girls PE, psychology, sociology, health, and even Missouri history at Clearwater R1 and was a coach of the volleyball team at that time. Now, she had initially been skeptical of the lights and in fact had told the press that after learning of the JV team's sighting in and around Brushy Creek, she had, quote, been making fun of Reggie and the boys, quote, around them. And yet, upon a drive across Clearwater's Lake's Dam, which blocks up the Black River, she reported seeing lights moving slowly across over the lake, essentially. She returned another day back to the lake with a friend, and this time reported seeing a light that seemingly lifted up out of the water in a reddish color. Now, rather quickly, there is a number of articles published in and around the Lead Belt about what is going on in Piedmont. The articles here come from Wayne County, but also from Ironton, and there was other ones I didn't include from Farmington, Poplar Bluff, a number of areas in and around that, Highway 67, 6049 corridor area. So here's a couple of the other sightings of note. Ken Johnson, owner of the Piedmont Park boat dock, said that he saw an object flying over Clearwater Lake at roughly 3,000 feet. He also related a story of campers in the area who had seen lights underneath the water of Clearwater Lake. And when they went to investigate and shine their flashlight upon the light source, the light disappeared under the water. In Annapolis, just north of Piedmont, two late night gentlemen who were gigging frogs along the Black River reported an object hovering above them in the sky. Two SEMO students, Ron Miller and Joe King, who lived in and around the Piedmont area, reported seeing a silvery object flying above Highway 34 near Patterson, Missouri. Dennis Hovis, who ran the local radio station KPWB, soon became the collector of various stories. People would call into the radio station and he would kind of get their information and their stories down to relate to investigators and those interested in the press later on. Police Gene Bearden, even though claiming he had seen the lights as well and had taken a number of media people in and around the area, expressed the sentiment to these same reporters that, quote, "I think that some people have let their imaginations run a little wild," end quote. And Mayor Roy Anderson of Piedmont disputed the sightings and claimed that he never saw anything during that time, but concluded that, quote, "We're a resort town, and if people come here, they leave some money here as well," end quote. Now, beyond the Piedmont area, there are also sightings that expand that entire region. Flat River residents, Henry Haggard and Bob Malone, photographed numerous objects in and around St. Francis County. Pilot Kenny Pringle and Marvin Coiler claimed to chase an object in and around the Farmington Airport. In March and April, additional sightings were seen all the way up towards St. Louis and St. Francis, Madison, and even up into Jefferson counties. And the image I showed earlier of the UFO landing was near Elsinore and led to some to speculate that a UFO had landed in the area. Across the Mississippi River in Grand Tower, Illinois, which sits across from Perry County, Missouri, a large object was seen hovering over Central Illinois Public Service Company's transformer yard, and that after it disappeared, the witness claimed that several jet airplanes circled the area as if looking for the object. And finally, and perhaps most interestingly, a case I'd like to look into a little more, actually, because there has to be records on it. And a truck driver driving on Interstate 55 south of Jackson, Missouri, reported seeing a large object seemingly chasing his truck along the interstate. When he stuck his head out to look and see what the object was, he was claimed to be struck in the face by some sort of light source object that broke his glasses. And actually, the Highway Patrol was actually called out to investigate that and had to issue a statement about what they thought was the cause of this light source and what happened to the trucker in that particular instance. And as we'll see, one of the investigators was called in to investigate that situation as well. Now, not everyone was seemingly on board with the idea of UFOs and lights in the sky above the Lead Belt and portions of Piedmont. A couple of editorials here of note. One comes from the Kansas City Star, which proceeds to ridicule in many ways the residents in and around Piedmont for what they are claiming to see up in the sky in their area. Additionally, a reprint from the Chicago Tribune alleged that perhaps because of the mining in the area, the spacecraft were related to individuals interested in mining prospects and getting raw materials out of the area. Now, turning to the investigators, an interesting name popped up first for me here. If you remember last year's presentation of Momo, the Missouri Monster, you'll remember the name Hayden C. Hughes as one of the individuals who came to Louisiana, Missouri to investigate Momo. He took footprint casts and sent them off to a zoo in Oklahoma. He interviewed several residents, and he became kind of the face of the Momo investigation there in the summer of 1972. Well, Hughes comes back to Missouri in 1973, and he comes to Piedmont to interview individuals, as you can see here on the image on the right. He claimed to be the director of the International UFO Bureau in Oklahoma City, and proceeded to collect not only eyewitness testimony and interviews, but also photographs of the area as well. Alongside Hughes came Dr. J. Allen Heineck. He was the chair of the Department of Astronomy at Northwestern University. He had spent roughly 20 years as a scientific consultant for the United States Air Force on UFO matters, spanning really about the 1940s to the 1960s, soon after Roswell up into the early 1960s. And he had been involved in a number of the major projects to investigate UFOs and was considered to be an expert by the Air Force in these various investigations. He came to Piedmont in 1973 to investigate the sightings at the request of State Representative Jerry T. Howard. And he was joined by Ted Phillips of Sedalia, Walter Andrews, director of MUFON, which was the Midwest UFO Network. And you can see Walt Andrews there right in the middle of that image, and Bob Cuny, who was also a MUFON member. Ultimately, he concluded that what was going on in Piedmont was not a hoax, but he found data inconclusive about most of the sightings. He could not confirm or deny certain instances. He told the press that he thought some of Maude Jeffries' photographs were not so much of UFOs or lights in the sky as they were lens flares coming from the camera of the distance lights. And in 1973, really after the Piedmont incident, he becomes the founder of the Center for UFO Studies in Evanston, Illinois, which later moved into the city of Chicago. Perhaps the most interesting person to investigate Piedmont in 1973 was a professor from Southeast Missouri State University named Harley Rutledge. He was a professor of physics at the university, and at first he was a skeptic. In fact, he wanted no part of what was going on in Piedmont. He allegedly told another professor he wouldn't go to Piedmont. He didn't want to get attached with it with a 10-foot pole. But after reports by students and people in the area, people concerned about what is going on, he cited, the stories of residents taking up guns in the area, basically to protect themselves from what they couldn't tell and what they couldn't see at night with these lights. He decided to investigate primarily to debunk it and to reveal information about it that would calm a lot of nerves in the area. And he went with initially Professor Milton, I'm sorry if I said this wrong, Ulecki, who was another professor at SEMO, and their spouses to the Piedmont area. After the first couple of trips, there was inconclusive information. There had been some lights in the sky, but nothing substantial to really change his opinion. He just felt that there was something unknown about them, but he wasn't necessarily completely sure about what it was. And yet, in May of 1973, when he opted to fly with a small group back to Piedmont in a small aircraft, he had what he later defined as really these 45 seconds of change, this major changes in his opinion. He was stunned, he said, by looking not only out of the aircraft and seeing one light, but then 2 and 3, and ultimately all the way up to 10 lights in the sky at different points of time. They essentially lit up over time, and some of them were arced in a row, some of them were separate by themselves, and they just seemed to increase as they went along and then eventually disappeared. Now, he became quite interested in this and proceeded to go several times back to Piedmont throughout the spring and summer of 1973. And he admitted later on that he was not so much a believer in what was going on, but more so, as he said, quote, an acceptor. And quote, I thought we were surely into something strange, end quote. For the next 5 years, Harley Rutledge would investigate various lights in and around not only Piedmont, but throughout southeast Missouri. And in fact, he did a number of investigations in and around the Cape Girardeau area as well. He went up to Farmington. He went out throughout the region to investigate these lights that he basically determined were nocturnal lights, but also perhaps UFOs as his conclusions. He even offered a class on UFOs at Southeast Missouri State for a period of time in the 1970s. And in 1981, he published his findings into a book called Project Identification. And if you're at the Center for Missouri Studies here in Columbia, you can actually find it. It is on the shelf and you can read through his findings. It's about a 200-page book, and it details not only his initial research trip to Piedmont in 1973 and his investigation that runs through 1974, but he brings it forward in time to about 1980 with various investigations he had done of UFOs in the area. Now, what's interesting about this book is that it includes not only images taken by his project crew and his various hypotheses about what was seen in the night sky and his own personal recollections of various events, but also data analysis. He actually takes the lights in the sky and proceeds to put them on a graph. He uses angles, he uses distance, and figures out in time where these objects would have been in the sky, what elevation they were at. And he's quite detailed in many of his findings in regards to what he saw between 1973 and 1980. And he admits in a lot of ways his changing interpretation over time, not only in the sense of becoming, as he said, an acceptor from the moment he arrived at Piedmont until 1981, but also times when his evaluation of the events changed to where he perhaps realized that something was not as mysterious as he once thought it was, and that actually a very logical explanation could be explained for various light sources over time. Now, in concluding in many ways for today, I want to talk about the theories put forth by residents, skeptics, acceptors in many ways about what was going on in and around Piedmont there in 1973. So here's a few of the theories that were put forth. Some residents expressed the opinion that the lights came from experimental aircraft flown by McDonnell Douglas to and from its location on the north side of Lambert Airport in St. Louis, essentially arguing that these airplanes that are under development are being flown from the airport. They're making short trips out. One of the obvious routes is to go south of St. Louis. They're flying through the area, and this is what it is that people are seeing in the sky, an aircraft they've never seen before. And that's the source of the lights and the various objects in the sky. Likewise, some posited that these lights and these crafts were military aircraft connected with Edwards Air Force Base, which is just east of St. Louis, as well as Whiteman Air Force Base to the west in Missouri, near Knobnoster. In relation to it being unknown technology, either from the United States or for foreign countries, some residents also really took note of the space race, saying that if we could put a person on the moon and get them there and put satellites in the air, anything they said was quite possible of things we don't quite know yet exist. Now, John Mullen, a research chemist at McDonnell Douglas, thought that the lights were rather hot plasma gas akin to ball lightning, noting the high tension lines near most sighting areas in between the lake, the town dump, and ultimately the drive-in theater. And some have correlated this with what's called St. Elmo's fire, which was luminous plasma, which creates a corona discharge during severe storms. Similar to last year's focus on the Hornet spook lights, remember we talked about how people had seen these lights in the distance, and one of the theories was that it was distant headlights on roads that were being seen over a long span of space. Well, due to the hilly terrain in and around Piedmont and parts of the Lead Belt, some people also posited that these lights were simply headlights on these back rural roads where you couldn't necessarily see the road, but certainly the lights at night would be coming through from a farther distance away. Now, in terms of the underwater lights in and around Clearwater Lake, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch suggested that perhaps they were flashlights from illegal poachers, and that as they were circling around the lake looking for their traps or looking for animals, that they were stumbled upon curiosity seekers of their own who had their own flashlights. So thus, once you shine a flashlight where you see a light, the person who was the poacher would be scared, turn off their light, and kind of disappear into the darkness. Now, citing the energy crisis going on at the time, other theories emerged that perhaps these objects were related to individuals who were interested in the raw materials to be found within the hills of the Lead Belt, even suggesting that they were controlled miniature remote aircraft and devices similar to drones of today that were being circled in and around the area to investigate various things in the hills. Now, obviously, today there are still sightings and there's still interest in the area. In fact, the Travel Channel did a show about 2 years ago on a series called Alien Highway about Piedmont and about lights in and around the Lead Belt area. So this still draws a number of interests of people. So I find it rather fascinating that this story continues on. And certainly here in a couple of years, it'll be the 50th anniversary of the Piedmont lights, and there'll be a number of interested parties certainly bringing that story back to the forefront again. But for the Missouri Mysteries for this year, I thought it was rather interesting to not only think about the UFO report, like I said, of the summer, but also thinking about the 75th anniversary of Roswell and looking at how lights in the skies, potential UFOs, was not just simply a story for another state, but it was very much important for a lot of people in a lot of parts of Missouri and drew a lot of interest. At its height, Piedmont residents reported most of their recreation sites, parking lots, conservation areas were full of people just staring up into the night sky, hoping to see some sort of light source of something that could perhaps confirm their suspicions or perhaps open up new questions overall. And I'll close for today with a poem that comes from the Wayne County Journal banner, which suggests not only a play on Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, but also provides a nice poetic perspective on the overall instance. Twinkle, twinkle, UFO, how I wonder what is so. Up above our world so high, shining jewels in the sky. When the evening sun is set on the highest hill I get, watching for your little light, twinkle, twinkle into sight. When the hour is drawing near, how I hope you'll appear. As I sit and heave a sigh, minutes into hours go by. So it seems to my fate, just too early or too late. And as I begin to doze, someone yells, there she goes. Twinkle, twinkle, UFO, someday, somehow we will go up above our world so high, just to bug you in your sky. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good afternoon.